Good afternoon, everybody. I know we've still got people joining, but in order to not start late, I'd like to begin our webinar on time. I'm Kirsten Ewens, the founder of All Rise, Attorneys for Climate and Environmental Justice. And with me here today is my colleague and the co-founder of All Rise, Janice Tooley. We welcome you all and thank you for attending today. We have hundreds of participants from South Africa and around the world, which shows how important these discussions around mental health are. I think we can all acknowledge that during the turmoil of the COVID pandemic, we realized how little mental health had been factored into the lockdown plans until the psychological repercussions of being locked into our homes, being cut off from social connections, and living in fear actually had on people, here and around the world. Section 24 of the South African Constitution speaks to our right to an environment that is not harmful to our health or well-being, and this includes our mental health and well-being. In listening to the findings of Dr. Garrett Barnwell, it is important to also keep in mind that everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected in terms of Section 10 of the Constitution. In terms of Section 11, everyone has the right to life. There are many more human rights in the Bill of Rights that intersect with mental health, and none are more so highlighted than in the report we are about to discuss. When we began working with our clients in Northern KZN, we could not help but notice their extreme feeling of hopelessness and fear. A sense of brokenness prevailed. There is a desperate need for awareness and assistance in the psychological space. In many areas of the country and around the world, there have been reports and discussions about the physical impacts of coal mining. What has been less dealt with, if at all, in South Africa, is the psychological impact of coal mining on mining impacted communities. While we at All Rise knew that the mental health of our clients required this study in order to ascertain what could be done to help them, Dr. Barnwell's findings were worse than we expected. There was, however, something positive and ancillary that Dr. Barnwell expressed, which we, being lawyers, did not anticipate. He observed that All Rise plays a fundamental role in healing the psychological wounds of its clients. Why? Because if collective trauma is associated with ongoing transgressions of human rights, then justice is essential to psychological well-being, and access to justice is something that we have provided. But now, let us move on to the primary purpose of this webinar, which is Dr. Barnwell's report. We are enormously grateful to Dr. Garrett Barnwell for his in-depth study, for his sensitive approach to our clients, and for his highly professional manner. Dr. Barnwell will present for 30 minutes, and each speaker thereafter for 10 minutes each. Please feel free to put any questions you have into the Q&A. There's no chat box. And Janice and I will scan and group them to put to the speakers at the end of the presentations. Depending on whether we manage to keep to the time, we hope to have 30 minutes or so for the Q&A from 3:45 to about 4:10, and then we'll close. So my introduction now is to our very first speaker and the author of the report, Dr. Garrett Barnwell. Garrett is an independent practice clinical psychologist with the HPCSA, with over 7 years of clinical experience and more than 12 years of international humanitarian and community psychology practice. He holds the following degrees from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa: PhD in psychology, MA in clinical psychology, MA in conflict transformation and management, honors in psychology, and additionally, he holds a professional diploma in humanitarian assistance from Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine in the United Kingdom, and a certificate of eco-psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute in the United States of America. He has relative professional expertise in the psychological impacts of mining, climate change, and environmental injustices. This expertise is based on his experience as a clinical psychologist and researcher, working directly with communities affected by large resource development projects in South Africa. As an expert on the psychological dimensions of climate and environmental justice issues, he is professionally active locally and internationally, holding various leadership positions, lecturing, publishing, editing, and reviewing extensively on this area of expertise. He also provides psychotherapeutic services for those affected by the above issues. Thank you, Garrett. Welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Kirsten, and also all rise. I'm just going to share my screen quick, and then we'll jump straight into it. Give me 2 seconds. Great. Okay, thanks very much. So my name's Dr. Garrett Barnwell. I'm a clinical psychologist, registered in South Africa. And today what I want to do is share with you some of the findings from the report that I produced for RISE. And today I'll just start with some of the methodology, the approach that was taken to the report, express some of the limitations, and then describe what are quite dramatic findings, which is the experience of collective trauma, some of the individual psychological impacts, the experience of place severing, and share some of what may be some of the clinical implications of a report like this. So just to give you a bit of background about the report. So it was commissioned by All Rise. The central question that was posed to me when I started the report was, what are the impacts of mining on the psychological well-being of community members interviewed today? The report was informed by my clinical experience, and this included some in-depth clinical assessments, psychometrics, which are psychological tests to look at areas like psychological distress, trauma, as well as anxiety. Did some collateral interviews, looked through documentation, and also integrated some of the psychological literature on collective trauma and trauma more generally. So the interviews took place in February to March this year, and then we had another group meeting to debrief in September. I interviewed 35 people, residents of Somkhele, from 26 families. They all could provide first-hand accounts of what had taken place and the changes that had taken place and how it affected their lives. I also did these interviews at residents' homes, so I was able to see conditions of living, and they were able to show how certain environmental conditions are impacting on their lives. The photographs, the report will be launched later today. I think at 4 o'clock it will be public, but I took photographs, those by myself, and then just to protect those, and I'll speak a bit about this later, so that the identities of those whom I interviewed were anonymized. So those who I interviewed come from area 1 and 2, where mining is operating at the moment. And most of those whom I interviewed came from Mfolozi Community Environmental Justice Organization and were referred to me by All Rise Attorneys for Climate Justice. Something important to bear in mind with the report is that many Mfetho can be considered an embodied health movement, where they have common relationships that they've bonded over in relationship to resisting environmental harms, ongoing stresses, and going through the experience together of recovery and navigating the experience of collective trauma. This quote comes from Kai Erikson, important figure in impact assessments. And what he writes is, those who experience environmental threats can come to feel estranged from the rest of humanity and gather together in groups with others of like mind, joined together by a shared set of perspectives and rhythms and moods. Then also members bond in terms of sense of, or they build a sense of bonding because of their relationship to place, shared culture, practices, and ways of becoming in the world. So I won't go into this in detail. You're welcome to take a screenshot, but something to emphasize here is that the interviews, there were in-depth interviews that involved taking quite detailed histories of what had taken place, and then it was complemented by psychological assessments to essentially determine the level of psychological distress experience. Where needed, I was also helped by Lihle Mbakazi, a cultural interpreter, lay counselor, and community organizer who works for All Rise. We also did a follow-up group, and this helped to check with the different members if my findings really reflected the reality on the ground. And that took place in September. Also important just to note is that it's not the first, although the first report written on the psychological impacts, it's not the first report written on the psychological impacts, but one where I go in detail interviewing people. There's overlaps with reports that have been conducted before as well, showing some kind of contextual validity. So some reports to really mention today, and who on the panel is a report by Sanda Benya, focusing on gender dynamics, Michael Edelstein, who focuses on the psychosocial impacts of open-cast coal mining as well, and his report came out in 2018, and then Dineo Skosana, who's been working on the grave matters, the impacts of the exhumation of graves and the impacts on communities. Then also the report was peer-reviewed by Michael Edelstein today on this panel, and I thank him for that, and clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst Coralie Trotter, who also received an award for her work on life as many arbitration hearings. So just some limitations of the report. It's important to bear in mind with a report like this, it's not about generalizability. So you're really looking at what is the impact, and you are interviewing people who have presented themselves as being impacted by mining. So that's just important, that the approach to this report wasn't to say what is the whole population experiencing. Language was obviously a barrier that was overcome through interpreter. And then just in terms of the scope of the study, I really focused on the experience of trauma, but there could be many other experiences as well on top of the experience of trauma that people experience. So neurocognitive decline would need to be assessed. Then also many people shared experiences of health complaints as well. And then I focus only on adults, and many of those who I interviewed remarked about how mining impacts on schooling and stuff like that. And that's really a neglected area. Just to acknowledge as well, a report like this focuses on the impacts, and I also don't want to negate that many of those who I interviewed also resist each day in some ways to improve their conditions, either through the legal system, organizing, or finding creative ways to improve their lives. So my main finding of this report, in my expert opinion, is that the accumulation of traumatizing and stressful events associated with the introduction and operation of open-cast coal mining in Somkhele has caused psychological injury, which is consistent with collective trauma and other adverse individual psychological reactions, such as continuous traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety, which have developed and are still being maintained by the ongoing accumulation of threatening or horrific events, some of which I will highlight in this presentation, but the report goes into a lot more detail and breadth in terms of what people have experienced. So what is collective trauma? It refers to the psychosocial effects of multiple stresses and traumatic exposures on a collective. This collective can either be, for instance, a family, a group, or community. The collective in this case of the report are the individuals and families whom I interviewed, who experienced significant loss associated with the disruptions caused by the relocations, ecological destruction in the area, the traumas of having their loved ones exhumed and reburied in unmarked graves, and those today fearing contamination as they live on the fence lines of open-cast mining. What's important in terms of understanding the impacts of collective trauma is what took place before, what was community like before, and what have the changes been over time. So this Google image is pretty much of the same area, where on the left-hand side you have the constellation of the community before, and then on the right-hand side you have the open-cast coal mining, where communities have been relocated and the area's been mined. And so when we think about it, and as you can see, it's quite a significant transformation. So it really, what Kai Erikson speaks about is communality. So the sense of bonds that are created in community with one another. In Somkhele, you see a specific kind of relationship that existed before, where people community was constituted in different ways. Some came to Somkhele fleeing the apartheid regime. Some were dispossessed from the establishment of the reserves in the area, and some originated from Somkhele originally. And but there was a community built together. A lot of people saw Somkhele as a place that they could be proud of. They had a sense of independence and a sense of security during a time of great upheaval. For all of those interviewed, Somkhele was really a home that they saw as advancing their lives and different aspects, sense of community, intergenerational wealth, well-being, etc. This doesn't negate the kind of struggles that people did have, you know, with, for instance, droughts that took place before, but even in terms of droughts, they said that these social networks that were there were able to support one another. The picture on the right is also a Google image of some of the houses from before. And what you can see is there's really a knitting of one another's lives, or quilting of one another's lives together. Homesteads had large subsistence farms, some nearer to the house, some further away. People kept cattle, goats, had chicken coos, and then also significantly what Danae will speak to as well later is their loved ones were buried in the homestead as well. All of these elements that are knitted together had significant spiritual as well as psychological importance that shaped one's sense of identity. And this is really see the significance of the bonds in people's experiences that they share about the trauma and stress that they've endured over time. And it really points to the adversities over time. So in terms of what has happened, so the main kind of trauma and stressful events described to me in my investigation was multiple losses associated with relocation, the disconnection from land, and the destruction of isibaya, which is cattle kraal, which means more than just wealth and nourishment, but it has spiritual and cultural values as well, and value for masculinity. The horror and sacrilege of exhumation and the reburial of deceased family members associated with the relocations that were also not always expected. Disruptions to identity and belonging through changes to the socio-ecology, and as you saw in that map, pretty significant, and I'll go into this in detail. Impoverishment through the loss of livelihoods and intergenerational wealth. So one sense of what I've been building up being ruptured in a sense, and seeing the changes as being worse than before. Chronic environmental health stresses and perceived contamination. So many live around the fence lines of mining, and dust is a daily part of their life. And I'll go into the implications of this, but people reported multiple health issues related to the dust that caused extreme psychological distress, and then also it exacerbated other health conditions, for instance, TB and asthma and so forth. And then just as those who have been following Somkhele, the atmosphere of violence associated with mining and also involving killings, different community members having to go into hiding and so forth. So the first one, I'll only highlight one or two of these for the sake of time, but just to highlight. So everyone described the relocation process as being stressful in different ways, and also quite undignified. And I'll give one example of that. In terms of the interviews, it's uncertain how many people supported the move, but generally people felt significantly betrayed by what took place. So people were moved from areas where the mine wants to operate, and it was done in different waves. Some were moved into temporary housing at first, some were moved into cluster housing, some were bought houses and stuff depending on when they were moved and so forth. There was also what people spoke about quite frequently was just how undignified they felt that the process was. So for instance, how much someone would be compensated for was depending on assessors that would come to the house and basically mark down the conditions of the house. Everything that was found to be wrong was marked down. Things that were quite important to the lives of those who have been dispossessed were things like the cattle kraal, so the isibaya, or the fields, or the graves. And the process in which these relocations took place incurred many losses as well. And I wanted to highlight one of them that is really a horrific event with major traumatic potential. So in my expert opinion, one of the significant traumatizing experiences has been the grave relocation process from homesteads in Area 1 and 2. The first stage of the trauma, and there's multiple stages that I can go through, relates to the grave removals and how people were exhumed. And the second stage of the trauma is associated with the reburial, where people were moved from the homestead into a very westernized kind of graveyard, but also even worse, that they were moved into what are essentially unmarked graves, as there are no tombstones or anything to identify who the family members are. People described this as a horrific experience that still has an impact on today. When I spoke to people, especially elders who followed the process, they became visibly distraught, describing these memories. Others said as well, I think important here is in terms of the anticipation of what took place. So a lot of people said that they didn't expect that the graves would be moved for mining. It's also important to say that the exhumation of graves isn't within traditional culture either. So this is a new practice that's been introduced by mining. And all of this contributes even or worsens the experience of trauma. So here I say, those whom I interviewed found the process to be psychologically disturbing. Several of those I interviewed had visible emotional facial reactions, were tearing up or crying when describing the process. Some of those interviewed likened the process to the wound that can never be healed. They expressed that the exhumation process was frightening as well. One resident said, for instance, I was scared. I felt that I had made a mistake to move, and I was afraid to see the bones of my family again. So some of the people that I interviewed said that they also witnessed their loved ones being exhumed. Some of those said that it was a child, a family member that were exhumed, and some of those who were buried were very recently buried, complicating the grieving process. Today, it's still complicating the grieving process because, as I said before, those who were moved are now in this gravesite and can't be identified. This causes a sense of, it's very disconnecting. So before, people would commune with and their loved ones or ancestors in the homestead, where now they can't even identify them and they've been dislocated from traditional ways of being in the world. Another one that I highlighted earlier, so the second traumatic process was the destruction of Isibaya, the cattle kraals. For those coming from Western communities, this can be overlooked as something that is important, but it's important to note that can be a symbol of masculinity. It plays an important role in the household for nourishment, for the accumulation of intergenerational wealth. There's also status that comes from having a cattle kraal. And all the men that I interviewed said that there was a loss of pleasure, there was sadness, and that their spirit felt like it had been changed. So a lot of people who I spoke to said that they struggle to re-engage with this part of themselves, feeling defeated by what had taken place. And this is a really important finding because it's also an aspect that wasn't compensated for during the relocation process. So some people said that how it was attended to was very undignified. So fences were built, for instance, while some houses for over years had been collecting rocks or proper pieces of wood to create this beautiful kraal. So then in terms of what I mentioned earlier, is there's also been a disruption to the accumulation of intergenerational wealth and livelihood. Some of these areas that have contributed to it is the loss of fields, as well as grazing land through the process. So, and then people have also been moved, some people have also been moved into cluster housing, where there isn't space, for instance, to have a kraal to, and they're further away from grazing land, for instance. And people said that it was a major change in livelihood, and it caused financial insecurity, dependence on the mine, and so forth. I won't go into this in detail, but there's multiple stresses that were expressed in relationship to housing. So it's quite clear that several people have been moved into cluster housing that don't reflect the kind of rural homes that people have had. There's very clear impoverishment that many people that I've interviewed experience. And then also in relationship to the conditions and blasting and stuff, there's been said to be a deterioration in terms of structures and so forth. So when you walk around the area, you can really sense the level of neglect. So you'll find windows being broken, roofs being damaged, and so forth. And these are daily stresses for people whom I interviewed, how to move beyond these conditions. Then I think this is one of the really important areas at the moment, and that contributed to the experience of collective trauma, which is the ongoing environmental threats that people experience. So although it's claimed that most people live within a safe distance from the mine, the psychological reality is devastating. Living in the mining areas, living in a reality of land that once sustained life of all kinds has been gutted, transformed into what is essentially a dust-stricken and rocky open-cast coal pit that for those interviewed is a source of daily environmental suffering. In my expert opinion, residents are exposed to several of these environmental stresses that contribute profoundly to this experience of collective trauma. These environmental stresses, just to summarize them, is the constant assault of dust, water insecurity, noise pollution, blasting, and the experience of perceived toxic contamination because of what residents are exposed to on a daily basis. These psychological impacts are inseparable from one another and compound over time. So it's not only one stressor that people have been experiencing, but multiple stresses that accumulate over time. All of those whom I interviewed described a pervasive sense of health insecurity, feeling that living in this area made them ill. And people describe multiple conditions that are outlined in the report that either exacerbated already existing conditions or that they attributed to the mining. So for instance, skin conditions, asthma, and so forth. And this is very much a neglected area that needs to be investigated more. So just to give you an idea of what it's like living next to a mine, open cast coal mine, the picture on the left is from one of the houses that I took. And this, the black there is the coal running down after rains into the house. So coal dust will gather all over the house. It comes into every crevice. The hand on the right is the hand of a person who I interviewed that just stroked their hand over the table as we were interviewing one another. He's sitting on a chair there that's brown because people have changed what they decorate the houses with, because everything becomes black. The photo on the right at the bottom, there's a JoJo tank at the back. We walked around to the house, shook the JoJo tank, and what comes out of the tap is black water. So it's, when you think of dust, it's really insidious and finds its way into every part of a person's life. And there's no boundary between the outside and one's body. And this is important because it creates a sense of distress, because one's sense of bodily integrity doesn't feel intact. There's also, what I just want to highlight is the atmosphere of violence that also further perpetuates the sense of collective trauma. My expert opinion, all these issues have occurred within a broader atmosphere of violence created over years since the operation of Tendele. This atmosphere of violence makes it difficult to engage in public participation and resolve issues. Furthermore, makes individuals and families incredibly vulnerable to further harm. There's been an extensive history that's been documented about Ngayechwa members being targeted for their dissenting views. It's well known that several members have also been targeted for raising their discontent. Most notably was also the killing of Somkhele Ntshingashi, who was assassinated 2 years ago. And this is really important because it's got a chilling effect on those in the community who fear reprisals. And those whom I interviewed, I think, just to also highlight is that they're mostly grannies, people with children, and really bonded by a sense of how they've been impacted. And so this polarization that's occurred really isolates those who have very legitimate concerns. And this leads me to what is also compounds the experience of collective trauma, which is the sense of institutional betrayal. So a part of this collective trauma is the betrayal trauma, where those who are responsible for protecting communities, so for instance, the mine, local government, or the government more broadly, who regulates policies and so forth, traditional leadership, are perceived as perpetrating wrongdoings, neglecting or scapegoating those who raise complaints, and are perceived as not responding appropriately to the traumatic and stressful incidents. Betrayal trauma, as we know from psychological literature, worsens the experience of trauma. So it's not only the trauma that's stressful, it's that no one protects, or that people feel like no one protects them or responds to correct the situation. So this leads me to what are the individual impacts, and we almost complete with the presentation. So 85% of those whom I interviewed met the criteria for continuous traumatic stress disorder. I've relied on the diagnosis of continuous traumatic stress disorder just because in this context, although people meet the post-traumatic stress, this is an ongoing situation. So the grave issues are still unresolved. Some of the housing issues are still unresolved. Many of the environmental issues are still continuing. And so there's a continuous process of trauma that's still ongoing. In terms of criteria, many of those express having flashbacks, reliving the experience. People described very vivid dreams that I describe in the report. Then people also exhibited many avoidance strategies. So either they didn't want to go to the graves because they're reminded of these stressful experiences, or they tried to avoid the mine in any way. And this is characteristic of trauma. And I go into detail in this in the report. It's also a very strong sense of arousal that people experience. So having difficulty falling asleep, for instance, being hypervigilant, being worried all the time, also having anxiety responses and so forth. Then also with the measures, I also looked at depressive and anxiety reactions. The measure that I use for depression gives a very good indication of the level of psychological distress that people are experiencing. And more than 90% of people I interviewed met the threshold for diagnosis of depression, indicating significant levels of distress. Most of those interviewed in terms of anxiety also experience higher levels of worry, restlessness, and sleep disturbances, etc. Many of the other symptoms I described in the report. However, I didn't suggest diagnosis of anxiety, but rather it's an indication of the level of distress. And this is because it can be considered a proportional reaction to what's happening to people. However, these reactions is just to show the level in which people suffer in these conditions. What was very concerning for me is also the sense of alienation that occurs in an environment such as this. And as we know, alienation often is also the sense of not wanting to exist. So a third of people reported suicidality in the last month, thinking they would be better off dead or hurting themselves. Many of those who expressed this were elders who had lived through the adversities and expressed significant distress about unwanted changes that had taken place. Those who voiced suicidality said it would be better off being dead than living under the current conditions they were subjected to owing to mine-related changes. They also experienced a significant sense of loss, sense of dispossession and displacement, assaults on traditional practices and ancestral connections, and a strong sense of hopelessness for the future. So feeling quite disempowered by the current conditions. And this also brings me to another part of the experience, which is the psychological experience of place severing. In my expert opinion, collective trauma of this nature is also violence against intergenerational ways of knowing, practicing and becoming, also known as epistemic violence, which can contribute to this experience of transgenerational, not only collective trauma, but also intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma, what it's also known as. The destruction of cultural knowledge, practices, and ways of being in the world is experienced as a trauma, can be transferred to future generations who carry a sense of shame, sadness, loss, anguish, and spiritual distress, among other traumatic reactions. So I'm sorry that I took a bit more time than expected, but I just wanted to raise what are some of these clinical implications. So in each interview, I asked those whom I interviewed what they thought would help heal from this process. And this is what emerged and what I agree with very much from my clinical experience. So first of all, if we consider this to be a continuous traumatic process, the physical safety and psychological integrity of those interviewed and other potential affected community members should be urgently prioritized. This may include the chronic, or must include the chronic environmental stresses and the atmosphere of violence that is established over time. This opinion is consistent with literature on collective trauma, where there's a recognition that even optimal adjustment to such environments is liable to carry costs to mental health and physical and psychological well-being. The second recommendation is for financial compensation for those who have experienced psychological damages, and the intergenerational nature of the collective trauma should be considered. It's also important to note that there are no mental health care services in this area. So people would, if they would like to access care, something needs to be established, or they would need to travel to other areas. All of these interventions, however, need to be guided by those most affected. Health-related issues were a critical source of psychological distress that are outlined in the report. An extensive health assessment needs to be conducted, because what appeared to me was that many of the complaints that people had weren't being addressed. Then I think this is very important when we think of collective trauma. It's not only the impacts on the individual, but it's also the collective. Part of it is the rehabilitation and reparations that could occur after such systematic events. And these reparations need to be culturally appropriate, psychologically informed, and perceived by the community as being meaningful. What I suggested can be included is, firstly, the identification and reparations related to the unmarked graves. And I'm sure Danae will speak more to this. Reparations for damages done to the sense of communality and cultural loss. Reparations for the loss of farming and grazing lands, isibaya, and livestock. Moreover, those interviewed wanted open access to water sources, which I didn't speak about, but many of the water sources have been cut off for their livestock and families, and desired that water sources that may have been damaged by mining are rehabilitated and water infrastructure improved. Most residents interviewed also wanted more meaningful and sustainable employment and vocational skills development, in addition to the areas for reparations listed above. Some residents wanted to leave the area as well after experiencing years of struggle. It was voiced that financial compensation and support would be appreciated. There was a sense of urgency, as many of those who I interviewed are literally living on the fence lines of open-cast coal mining. And because of the trauma that they've experienced, they continuously experience suffering. So just in terms of a suggested citation, more than welcome to take a screenshot. And I thank you for the time that you've taken to listen to me.
Thank you very much, Garrett, for your time today, and for all the time you've spent interviewing people, and the time that you've invested in making sure that the report was professionally, the information was professionally gathered. For those who joined a little bit late, we are having a series of speakers that will now speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A at the end that we will, so just put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom conference here, and then hopefully we'll get to them at the end.
Hi everyone, it looks like there's been a technical issue. What I'm going to do, I'm going to move straight on to Dineo. Dr. Dineo Skosana is a senior researcher and the project leader of the coal mining project, which investigates South Africa's transition from coal to renewable energy at the Society, Work and Politics Institute. Her specific focus on the project is on mining-induced dispossession, which is central to rationalizing, amongst other reasons, why the transition from coal is necessary. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Witwatersrand. Her doctorate research explored the contestations over coal mining and African grave exhumations in the Mpumalanga province in South Africa. She has previously worked and published extensively on the continued salience of traditional leadership in post-apartheid South Africa, and she has an interest in indigenous politics, rural struggles, as well as politics over land, sacred sites, heritage, and belonging. Thank you very much, Dineo. You may take over.
Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen quickly. Let me see. Screen sharing is the presentation. And put this into presentation mode. Well, I think first and foremost, I should say congratulations to Gareth for putting together this brilliant and insightful report, and congratulations to All Rise for commissioning it. The report, as he has presented, meant to probe the impacts of on the psychological well-being of the community in Somkhele, and he has shared some of his findings, but I'll try and summarize these quickly for the sake of time. Gareth found that mining has caused psychological harm or injury to the community, and he shows in the report that living in a coal mining area has chronic stresses, and he also establishes a relationship between trauma and institutional and responsiveness, and so he speaks about how the experience of collective trauma is inseparable and is actually linked to the failure of the government. And by the government here, we also refer to other alternative forms of governance, such as traditional authority. In my own work, I locate the unresponsive state within the reformed laws, which have loopholes and therefore allow for what I call lawful exclusion in my work. And this is, or lawful exclusion rather, refers to a system within which communities are dehumanized within the parameters of the law. I was struck by the similarities found in the study in relation to mine. And just to give you a background, in my own area of work, I was interested in the question about what communities lose because of mining. And I was particularly interested at the household relocations as well as grave relocations. And I undertook the study in Somkhele in 2019 until 2022. Of course, there were interruptions because of COVID. And so I had conducted interviews and then conducted follow-up interviews. And I used oral histories. I conducted about, or collected rather, 30 oral accounts. And I also undertook grave sites visits. I visited about 3 cemeteries in the area, but also obviously I was allowed to enter into the homestead graveyards as well. And I undertook grave sites visits because these were important, and as they are sites through which we can understand the living, their histories, and the politics thereof. And I will then speak to the findings, which are very much similar to what Gareth actually finds. Gareth in his report speaks about finding a fractured community or fractured social relations. And in my own work, I speak of intangible loss. And intangible loss is the kind of loss that is difficult to measure, and it is not quantifiable because it's both psychological and spiritual. And he then focuses on the relocation process. And in my own work, I revisit the idea of the dispossessed being dispossessed once more. This has been articulated by earlier scholars at SWAP who worked in the Platinum Belt. And Gareth again cites the undignified asset assessment during the household relocations. This was a process rather that devalued communities' assets, and so it was quite a dehumanizing task which the mining company undertook to assess what would be at loss and how must it be compensated. And in my own work, I frame this as material reductionism. And just to give you a brief of how I define this concept, and I actually explore it in my upcoming book. Material reductionism is a socially constructed mental image of mining affected communities, which cannot be applied without some degree of classism and racism. To begin with, when material reductionism is applied, those who are subject to the eyes of mining companies are first profiled and racialized, to be precise, then classed. This process allows the mines to determine the degree to which they must adhere or not to the law and calculate what is at stake. Essentially, a materialist or a material reductionist eye dehumanizes at first sight in order to therefore justify further dehumanization and injustice. This is an approach where the use of language of evaluation is reduced to material aspects that evaluators can see and replace. So, for instance, mining companies would come in and say, oh, this piece of land, and tree, right? And they would say, already, meaning like your house is cracked. And so already they're trying to find faults or negatives, and therefore deeming what's fit to give to the community or the family, but sometimes not understanding the importance of Isibaya, as Gareth would have presented, also in my own area of work, but also the importance of the land and the connections that communities will have to the land itself. And Gareth then was to speak about exhumations and reburials, and finding very sort of similar accounts to what I actually found. And I thought I'd speak to or tease out this aspect of loss, because as I've said, I cover also the loss of land, but for this presentation, I'll just stick to grave relocations. And so I began at least in 2008, but I still need to verify this particular day. Mining company did not follow the provincial or national heritage law, which provides for the protection in the relocation in KZN and in South Africa. And I'll give you an example. We experienced undertakers, as well as North Coast Funeral Parlour, which did not follow the legislation about how a grave, for instance, that is younger or older than 60 years old, 100 years old, inside or outside a formal cemetery must be relocated. So there are regulations about how you relocate graves. Actually much more important, because these graves are located within the homesteads, and therefore the law actually has to be applied much more vigorously. And an archaeologist actually has to be present and not an undertaker. And all of their families described undignified exhumations and the handling of their remains and reburials, as well as these being placed in unmarked cemeteries and so on. And the families gave me an estimate, and this I still also have to verify. They said about 300 graves are missing as we speak. And this is believable because, for instance, you'll find that one family would have 11 graves in the homestead. Some have even up to 30 ancestral graves. So it's believable how you can arrive at that number, and perhaps even more. And so then in my work, I show that the mishandling of the ancestral remains and the loss of graves, as well as the inadequate compensation. And just to flag that South Africa has no guideline for this. The compensation is called the wake fee. So there's no regulation, and that is actually a loophole that mining companies exploit. And this has led to what I call spiritual insecurity in my own area of work, which is a state of disconnection and continuous anxiety about one's relationship and standing with those who have passed. And so then Garrett notes that mental health is inseparable from physical health and community well-being, right? And my work adds to that. Mental health is also inseparable to spiritual well-being. Just to demonstrate, the impact on the spiritual well-being on the families, and there's many actually accounts of this nature, but I just pulled one. For instance, I referred to Baba X's response when I asked him, how do you feel about not being able to visit your father's grave? And his response was, kunzima kakhulu, kunzima. It is very difficult. It's very difficult. He replied, I sometimes go to search. It feels like I'm losing my mind. Honestly, it's not a good thing. It is uncommon. Please pardon the spelling mistakes and so on. I still have to work on that. I'm articulate in Ukuluma Sizulu, but Ubala, that's where I actually rely on other people for editing. But the point here is that listening to the transcript, Yagababa, a few months later, or even our conversation, I realized that his words, which I sometimes go to search, rested heavily on me. They were mentally and emotionally disturbing to me as a researcher. Mind you, there are 29 more accounts of this nature. The thought of a 68-year-old leaving his home to look for his father's grave and others is disturbing to imagine. I wondered whether this would be a conscious decision to prioritize the search on one's daily schedule or an unpremeditated activity. So Ubaba, does he plan and say next week, so does he plan and say I'm going to go look for my father's grave? Or he goes to town and decide so is it something that maybe he says, okay, let me just pass by the gravesite and see whether I'll find it here. So I think that really rested heavily on me. As I write, I continuously hear his words and many others, people's accounts. But this demonstrates both the psychological and spiritual instability that the families have experienced. And I took a picture there. I'm not too good at taking photographs, but this was during one of the cemetery visits that I undertook. And as you see, these are unmarked graves. You don't know who's rested there. But also, I found it problematic that the people were relocated for mining and their ancestors are placed right next to a mining dump. And that shows how the dispossession continues when the people are dead and when they are alive and dead. And I've said this in many of my presentations. And I'll say it now again, because that mining dump is a constant sight and a reminder of dispossession that has taken place. And I'm about to wrap up. And so, for instance, that's another cemetery, again, where they are unmarked graves and people don't know where these are. They don't know where their loved ones are. And it creates a sense of anxiety, depression, all those sort of conditions that Garrett actually picks up in his work. And there were two key points of interest for me, particularly in his report. One is the role of social movements in relation to healing. I have never thought about how the idea that communities that experience collective trauma can find healing within organized spaces. So, for instance, being part of Umqejo, communities are actually able to find some form of remedial hope, and it brings to some a form of comfort, right? That maybe there will be change, and this is the kind of comfort that the state has failed to deliver because it's unresponsive, which Gareth's report also touches on. And the last part on the points which I thought were interesting is what he identifies as intergenerational trauma. This is important because in my work, I'm able to pick up how those who are dispossessed by mining were dispossessed historically during the colonial and the apartheid period, right? And some were dispossessed in order to create protected areas. And now they're experiencing dispossession because of coal mining. And so you see how this is a continuous experience for this Black community. And in closing, I think what's very important, which this report highlights, is the importance of interdisciplinary research to support community struggles. I was struck in particular by how, even though I'm coming from a background of political science with a little bit of training in history, and Gareth comes from psychology, our work could actually still speak to each other. And the findings in some ways were very similar, although we use sort of different language to name things and to understand how powerful this kind of collaborations can be. And so congratulations to ORISE for actually putting us together, people who normally wouldn't actually bring our work together. And I had a question, this goes to Gareth. In closing, I'm actually done. This is my final point. And Gareth, I was wondering, and you'd have to respond to this, and it's not a criticism, because I think that report is really excellent and a starting point for us to do much more. But my question was, when you're conducting the 35 interviews, how significant or not was the language barrier in illustrating the direness of the problem? And I'm asking this because I found in my study that, for instance, when you're listening and you understand Zulu, right? The tone, the pause, the silence, the sudden incoherence, the lack of eye contact and repetition, when someone says, iyalimaza sisi, noma ibuhlungu sisi, ibuhlungu, and they repeat, that actually illustrates what the person is actually going through, and you can see it on their face. You can see how sometimes as they're talking, they don't maintain eye contact with you. So I wanted to ask, were you able to pick up that, and perhaps through your training of psychology, maybe that enabled you to maneuver even the language barrier? So I'd like you to maybe speak to that a little bit more. But thank you so much for a very insightful and comprehensive report. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Daneo, and thank you for the question at the end, which we'll save to the end of all the presenters presenting. I would like at this point to invite our next speaker, Asanda Benya, to join us. Asanda is a feminist activist, a senior lecturer in the sociology department at the University of Cape Town, and a fellow at STIAS in Stellenbosch. Her work focuses on the intersection of gender, class, and race. Her current research looks at women and mining in South Africa. She teaches in and convenes the critical labor studies stream at UCT. She has published in labor and feminist journals in areas of women in mining, gender and the extractive industries, labor and social movements, and social and economic justice. Thank you very much, Ayanda. Over to you. Asanda, sorry.
Thanks, Kirsten. Also, good afternoon, everyone. As Kirsten's already said, my name is Asanda Benya. I'm not going to take long. I want to thank Allrace first for the invitation, and also Garrett for sharing his very, I suppose, I don't want to use the word interesting because that's what we use quite a lot. It was a very, it was traumatic reading the report, Garrett, and taking me back to Somkhele and some of the things that people told us when we were doing our study in Somkhele. So thank you for sharing the study. It's really distressing, the report. But one thing I appreciated about it, and there are many things I have appreciated about reading the report and you having done the study with Riche, with the support of Allrace, is just the ways in which it's highlighting mental health issues. I think this is a pandemic globally, but a pandemic in our country, but there's also a denial that this is a pandemic in the country, pandemic in Black communities, also in working class communities, in rural communities. It's not something that just affects middle class, urban people, but it affects all of us, and the consequences are dire. The consequences are generational and they're long-term. I think that's one of the things I really appreciated about reading the report, just that, and I think it really, and I'm hoping that it really shifts the discourse around mental health on people, but also mental health. So another layer of what I appreciated it is how you are directly linking the structural things with the personal. I think in most cases, at least in the studies on psychology that I've done, there tends to be an overemphasis on the personal. But I think what I've appreciated about your study is personal, the community, so the interpersonal stuff, but also the appreciation of the structural and the impact of mining in particular on the psychosocial or psychological health of people in these mining communities. And I think it shifts the discourse somewhat when it comes to the impact of mining. I think for a very long time, the discourse has been driven by economists, the discourse has been driven by developmental specialists who have emphasized things that are somewhat contradictory and contrary to people's experiences. And I think you having brought in people's experiences in the way that you have through this report, I thought it was really, really powerful, and I really appreciated it about reading the report. But another thing that I appreciated is just how I think the report you've done speaks to so much that has been done in Somkhele, but also in other mining communities. And it really amplifies what people have been saying about mining, but not articulating in the psychological kind of language that I think you have in this report. So in a way, adding to that kind of literature, and hopefully people will listen. So I'll share a little bit about my own work, but there's two things in relation to Garrett's work that I wanted to highlight. The first thing is around workplace, because I do think there's an interaction between what's happening at home and what's happening in the workplace, what's happening in community and what's happening in the workplace when it comes to some of the things that Garrett has talked about. In fact, in your paper, my reading of it was you somewhat surface, but not to a great extent or huge extent, what's happening. And so I wanted to just again tie or sort of weave a thread between what you shared about people's experiences around the community in Somkhele with what I was hearing in my own study. And I'll try and keep it very short because I was only told to speak for 10 minutes. So the first thing is around the workplace and highlighting what's happening there. The second thing, I think Garrett uses the word trauma. Because I'm a sociologist by training, I appreciate the word trauma because I think it actually speaks to the deep and very personal. But the word that I've been using, or that I use in the report that I wrote based on work we did in Somkhele, and I did that work with Tendele Coal with a whole lot of other people supported by Fast in Action, the Swiss-based NGO that assists some of the NGOs in the country, but also movements that are working around questions around mining. So I wanted to speak then to the question around violence, not extended, like I said, I was only given 10 minutes, but a bit of background on the study that we did in Somkhele this year. It started this year, but the literature review, it started last year. Our study, and it speaks directly to what some of Garrett's findings, our study, we're looking at what is the gendered impact of mining on workers and in communities. And we wanted to focus specifically on large-scale industrial mines and the ways in which they affect or differently affect men and women. We took a somewhat multi-lens approach, and we wanted, by taking that multi-lens approach, we wanted to highlight the distinct ways in which men are affected by mining and the ways in which women are affected by mining, and how this is disproportionate, but also highlight the intersections between capitalism, which is mining in this case, patriarchy, racism, because I think when you go to Somkhele, when you go to the Mtuba area, you see how all of these kind of intersect or interact with each other. We wanted, therefore, through the study to map how advantage and disadvantage as a result of mining is spread between men and women. And we looked at work, and we also looked within the community. While we foregrounded gender in our study, we were very cognizant that people's lived experiences are not just or only gender. There are other social markers, social identity markers that influence, affect people's lived experiences. So things like the fact that this is a rural community, the fact that this is a working class community. And what is interesting in the case of Somkhele is that not too far from it is a place that some people know as a holiday destination, St. Lucia. And I think those things kind of highlight just how there's that it's not just the mine, but it's the mine in relation, it is definitely the mine, but there's a whole lot of other layers such as race, such as class, such as gender, that one can also add or layer as a way of making sense of what's happening in Somkhele. We conducted about 20 semi-structured interviews with people who were affected. And when we were at the beginning, we went there with particular ideas about who would be affected, who would be directly and indirectly affected. But as we were talking to people, some villages that are very close to the mines, and I don't like using the word area A, area B, or area 1, because I think what we were, as we're doing interviews with people, people insisted on using their village names when we were talking about these different sites. So when we're talking about, when we did interviews, we were doing interviews with people who were affected directly and indirectly. But one thing that struck us was that even those who were not necessarily in communities, to use Garrett's word, that were around the fence, the communities that were a little far, that even they were directly affected actually by what was happening in the areas that we tend to focus on when we're talking about Somkhele. In addition to semi-structured interviews, we conducted 2 focus group discussions with people around the areas, and people were affected and people from different villages in the Somkhele area. Our focus was to map and to see, so asking questions about life prior to the arrival of the mine and life after the arrival of the mine. So during the past few years, what has happened? What has changed? How is it gendered? How has it affected people? So when we were mapping out this change with this, and again, we're not looking for representativity here, but we wanted to hear people's voices, and we wanted to see what's happening and to be able to begin to pilot what is happening. So the focus in our conceptualization of the project was on the socioeconomic impact, the ways in which people's lives, the ways in which people's livelihoods have been affected. But what we came up with, and what we came up with, which resonates with what Garrett was sharing just now, was that we could not dissociate or separate the socioeconomic from the psychosocial part. So there was a big interaction in how people talked about whether it's livelihoods, you could see, and people articulated how livelihoods directly linked to these questions of the psychological, which is what I think speaks so much to Garrett's work. So our findings, and I'm not going to go into them because they very much resonate with what Garrett has shared and a bit with what Dinewa has shared, and also what I've read from some of Dinewa's work. One thing, though, that I wanted to highlight about our work and our findings, and also link it to Garrett's work, is that it speaks to Somkhele primarily, but anyone who has read about mining in South Africa, in Southern Africa, in the continent generally, or across Global South, I think a lot of these findings actually speak to people's communities beyond Somkhele. So this is the picture of mining in Somkhele, but this is the picture of mining across the continent. The trauma in most of the narratives that we got when we were doing the interviews, really trauma was very much palpable. We were also, just by listening to people's experiences, people's stories about their lives before mining, the trauma, you could see it, you could feel it. And I think one thing that Garrett highlights is that it's collective, because in every interview we conducted, you could see how some of these stories were shared in the sense that the experiences were shared by people. People had all been collectively, forcibly removed from point A to point B or to multiple. So the trauma, the palpable trauma, was very much a collective, even in the study that we did. Something that I don't focus on in my work, and I think Garrett also kind of highlights in his study, even though he did not, is the impact on children. And I think when we talk about the impact of mining, we tend to focus on adults, we tend to focus on people who are in my area, in my case, people in the workplace and in other studies, people in communities, but not much on children. But I think while we don't foreground the impact on children, it's very obvious that this is affecting children too. In one of the interviews, focus group discussions, in fact, when we were talking to people, asking them to sort of quantify the impact, one of the things that we came up with, and that people in the community hall where we were doing this in this focus group discussion, was that it had affected them so deeply and so negatively. But what really broke people was the fact that it has already affected and started affecting their children. And this is compromising the next generation. It's not just compromising their identity, their sense of belonging, their sense of community now, but it's also compromising the future generations. People, children around the community, a lot of times while the focus in our study was adults, men, women, a lot of times during interviews, grandparents would call their grandchildren, come, open your eyes, let them see, and the eyes would be watery. So the trauma, but also the physical impact on children, on their bodies and so forth, but also the impact on psychological impact, in the sense that I remember some of the interviews we conducted where children could not attend or enjoy school the way that most people maybe in this call went, enjoyed school, enjoyed childhood, because they cannot see, they have sinusitis, their playtime is completely restricted, and how all of these translate into, if you're using the language that Garrett speaks to or uses, into trauma, right? Because as a child, you want to go, you want to play, you want to do all these things, but all of those mediated by your experiences of having been born and having been raised in a mining community. Some of the other things that speak to our work in the study hours, it's not available online, but I think it will be, I don't know when, in the next few days online. It's the words that speak to our findings are words like dehumanization. And I think this is something that comes up a lot in the report that will be released at 4 o'clock, dehumanization, humiliation, undignified lives, alienation. But another one that came up in relation to these is assassination. And I think there was someone in the talk in the chat box who talked about assassinations also. And I think when we were conducting our study, the impact of Mama Fikile's assassination on the people in the community, but also the impact, the threats of assassination in the community, instilling fear in the community, instilling fear, especially in the activists. So all of these are kind of concepts and concerns that resonate with the work that we did and the findings that we came up with. But like I said, I wanted to focus on the experiences of work. And I think it ties in very well with the experiences or some of the narratives that Garrett outlines in his report. What in our study we saw was that what's happening at work ties in or speaks to what's happening in the community. The stresses that affect people at work are taken home and they compound the stresses that are already there in the community. So what are some of the things that at work? I'll just throw in a few words because of time. Insecurity at work for those who had these jobs. We're saying that insecurity is what marks their lives at work. Low wages, yes, they have a wage, but these are not living wages. These are not wages that can, when you think about what they have lost, when you think about the promises that were made at the beginning, these wages are so low that they don't even begin to measure up to what they have lost and what they were promised. It's not a question of only wages, but also you have people who have these jobs, but they don't really have rights at work. They can't really speak up at work. So you have this income insecurity, but also unions at work that some people that we spoke to felt were compromised, deeply compromised. So you have exploitation that's playing out in the workplace and how that affects people outside of work and the interaction between these two spaces and these experiences. Another one that people spoke to, and I think it's also there in Garrett's report, is vulnerability. People, even when they have these jobs, vulnerability continues to mark their lives. Some of the people we spoke to formally and informally, but also people who were ex-workers, that you constantly, there's this fear of being dismissed, but there are also arbitrary dismissals, and people had experiences, and we document this in our report, the vulnerability. And I want us to think about just how these all compound what Garrett speaks to as trauma, as psychological impact on the community, when even when you have a job, you're not necessarily free or feel like this is a job that can sustain you and your family, because you constantly have you're vulnerable. You have no proper representation or proper support from whether a trade union or anybody around. So fears and feelings of vulnerability, arbitrary dismissal, but also no voice because of the union challenges that we know are playing out in Somkhele, but I think are playing out across the mining industry in the country. Precarity is another word that I would use also to speak of workers' experiences, that these are people who've been forcibly removed, dispossessed, displaced, and who've been compensated, but with very, very, very unfair low compensation, who also have no sources of sustainable livelihood. So precarity being something that, again, marks their lives. Excuse me. Another one that I think speaks to what happens at work, that also sort of affects what happens at home, but speaks very much to Garrett's report, is around health and safety at work. For mine workers, especially in coal, but also in gold and platinum, where I do most of my research, health and safety at work is not something, it's something that's deeply compromised. But also we know that when it comes to, especially in the case of Somkhele, TB is something, silicosis and so forth, not just Somkhele, but across the mining industry. And we know that also from research, from other studies, literature, and certainly from our research, is that people or workers hardly get compensation for occupational diseases. There is overwhelming evidence that demonstrates the ways in which mining compromises people's health, whether these be workers or people living in communities near the mine. Currently in Southern Africa, historically actually, over 500,000 former mine workers, and also the numbers currently are quite high, even though we don't have the exact figures. Families are affected. There are so many people are sick and dying of TB and silicosis, and especially people who have worked in gold, but also especially in coal mines, whether in Somkhele or in areas around or across the Witbank area. TB being contagious, this is very important. Extended family members also get it. So this is something that's happening at work, but it's something that affects very much and very directly family members, extended family members who have nothing to do with work, who do not get these low compensation from work, but who are directly affected by TB that is contracted at work or in the workplace. And we know that the burden of caring for people when these diseases are transmittable to the home space, the burden falls on women. They're the ones who do the primary caregiving work when diseases are repatriated, whether to the mining communities around the mine or very far away places. Women are the ones who do the care work. They are the nurses, because we know that a lot of these mines, especially in the research that we've been doing, Somkhele and in the interviews, is that some of the mine does not take much responsibility or any responsibility for caring for workers who are sick as a result of this. So you see how, even though the psychosocial, the psychological, yes, in the workplace, but also that workplace transferred to the home space to a woman who is not necessarily even working. And we know with COVID, the examples and the stresses that we've all seen around COVID is that care work is not small. It's not small work. It's really taxing, emotional, stressful, deeply psychological. We know that a lot of people who were caregivers during COVID are now struggling with mental health. And this is something that for women in mining communities, women who've been caring for mine workers who are sick, but also women in Somkhele, where we conducted this study, also talked about that when you have a sick husband or when you have a sick male relative, they're coming home sick, they can't breathe, it affects you, it affects your mental well-being, it affects the children, it affects how you show up, it affects how you hold space for the entire family. But also some people talked about not just the psychological, but also the monetary, that when you have a sick loved one and you're having to do the care work because it's seen as your job as a woman, in most cases, you have to sacrifice looking for work, you have to sacrifice taking care of your own body, your own self, your own mind for the sake of the person who is sick because of the mind. So you see how it's not just exploitation at the point of production, but it's also the super exploitation, the super insecurity, this precarity, all of these other things that are transmitted from work to the home space. I was going to talk about violence, but I don't think I have any more time. But violence being endemic in all of these cases, whether it's Somkhele or other mining areas. And I think Garrett's report sort of highlights the multiple ways in which violence takes place at a symbolic level, at a structural level, but also at an interpersonal level and the kind of psychological impact that that has. Dust in the area, how that affects people. If you cannot breathe, the kind of anxiety parents have as a result of children inhaling dust, them inhaling dust and feeling helpless, because what can you do as a parent when your children are playing outside? There's not much you can do to protect them. So these kinds of what I see as violence and how they affect people also in gendered ways, but also quite like just the dire impact that these have on the psychological well-being of the community, of people. I'm not going to go any further into the violence. I'm happy to have a conversation around that. But one thing that I wanted to highlight is basically just how this trauma plays out in different ways, but also how the trauma, it moves between the community and the workplace. And there's that intersection that I think we need to constantly pay attention to. One thing though, just before I close, is that the devastation in Somkhele, what I saw there is it's not periodic, it's daily. It happens every day. People, every time when we went to interview them, they were like, oh, you just missed it. Just 2 hours ago, this whole place was dark. Just 2 hours ago, there were trucks moving up and down here. Just like last season, we could not farm at all. In fact, it's been happening for the past few seasons since the mine came. So you see how the devastation is daily, the devastation that's happening at multiple levels, at livelihoods level, at psychological level. It's daily, but also it's long-term, it's felt collectively. And I think in my work, one of the things I'm trying to show is how it is gendered, how it's class, and how it's racialized. One thing as a way of closing is that mining narrative in South Africa. I think when you look at the study that Gareth has done, some of the work that Noah does, and the work that we did in Somkhele beginning of the year, is that there's a need to change the mining narrative in South Africa. And there's a need to amplify these kind of experiences, because for a very long time, the narrative has been that, well, but people get jobs at the end of the day. What do you mean, you know? But I think what you're hearing, what you begin to see when you start doing deep research, thorough, going deep down, you see just how the impact is actually more of devastation than of development. It's more of hurt and harm than of happiness and all the things that mining capital wants us to believe. Thank you so much. I'll hand back to you, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Asanda. As much as we would like everybody to be able to speak for as long as they want on their subject matter, because it is so interesting, we do have 2 more speakers and we still want time for the Q&A. So without wasting any time, I'm going to hand over now to our community speaker. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon. A resident to next ward, Somkhele mine. I'm Sibongile Zwane. My family has been there in that area for more than 60 years. And I'm married to that family for more than 30 years. We had a very beautiful land and we were benefiting a lot from that area, because we used to plant crops and we are also animal production farmers. So before, we were living very well. We had no problem. And if I'm looking at it now, I feel like crying, because now I have to live in a very and horrible condition. As it is now, I'm living in a very horrible, and it is traumatizing to live in that area as the mine came. First of all, when the mine came in our land, it divided us from the community members, and it also divided us even amongst my own family members, because we were not included when they were conducting meetings. We were told that we are not involved. So when we heard that there is mine that is going to be developed in our area, we were never consulted. No one consulted us. Unfortunate for me and my husband, we are working far in Durban. We are working very far in Durban. And when they were conducting all those meetings, we were never involved. But only to find that afterwards, because we used to phone my mother-in-law, she told us that now they are fencing around the house without our consent, without talking to any one of us. When we inquired, what's happening? They said, no, they were just doing favor for us. What kind of favor? Even if you are doing a favor to a person, but you can't talk to that person. You can't just fence the house without any consultation. Only to find that the mine was just behind our house, but no one said anything. We've been affected by dust all the time, affected by noise throughout from during the day and at night. We've been affected by when they are blasting, our houses now are being cracked. And when we complain to the mine, they said, no, we are just beyond the meters that is, they said we are too far. We are not within the meters that is, that needs to be removed. Because some of the family members, they were removed because they were just having a mine on those family areas. But because we're next to them, they did not remove us. They said the only thing when we were telling them that we are being affected by the dust because we can't even do the washing. Dust is all over the house. You can't enjoy even the water that is coming out from the rain in our JoJo tanks because all the dust is just flooded on top of the roof, and it is drained to the tank when it's raining. So we can't even drink that water because it's contaminated. When we were telling them about that, they said, no, it is not harmful because coal dust is just from the plants, of which really we didn't understand what does that mean. How can anyone just eat dust because it is just built from the plants? We were very frustrated about that because it was clear to us that they were just looking down upon us. We tried to spoke to Izinduna and to even the tribal authorities. They said, no. All the negotiations were done with the mine, so there is no one who is having the land. So now, really, it is very much frustrating because we had cattle, we had goats, we had even sheep, we have even pigs that were living on those things because we're selling them, we eat meat from them. Even if we don't have money, we sell all those things to get something to eat. But now we are unable because all of those things, they are just dying because of the coal dust. Some of them, they just get lost inside the mine. And when my husband, at one stage, my husband tried to find out his cattle inside the mine and he was arrested. They said he is trespassing, yet our cattle and goat used to get inside the mine because that land is our land where they used to graze. It is our grazing land. And all of those things were just taken by the mine without our consent, without even negotiation. When we asked, why are you doing that? They said they were given by by Inkosi. When we asked, okay, can we please get in, what do we call this thing? I will get is the sale agreement, so that we get to know the understanding, what is it that we have agreed upon, and why we were never told about all those things. No one said anything. When we asked that gentleman who was the leader of the mine by that time, I don't know whether he was a CEO or what, but he said he also tried to get the sale agreement, but he couldn't find it. Of which really I don't understand how come a person can have a development or can have the place to work on without having any sale agreement, because there are people that are living in that area. Which worries me a lot is that I've got 3 kids that get sick because of that mine. Since we stayed there, for all those years that we have stayed there, we have never had any history of TB before. But after this, the mine started there, it was in 2006. In 2008, my kids and one of my kids and 2 kids from the other brothers, they got sick at the same time of TB. And also that thing worried me a lot. And in 2013, not even 2013, from 2010, my mother-in-law started having coughing problems. We keep on taking him to hospital. She was tested and nothing was found. Nothing was found. Only until in 2018, when she was diagnosed of having lung cancer. Also, that thing worries me a lot, because in the family, there is no history of lung cancer. I do have sleepless nights because we've tried to fight this thing. What was happening because of this mine. We've engaged with 3 lawyers, of which it went to vain. We only understand that it's because we don't have money. We are people that are having, which doesn't have lots of money compared to the mine. Because when we spoke to those lawyers, it was as if they were also worried. They said, no, something must be done. No one can just take your land without any compensation. They should have spoken to you before even doing anything. But once they go to the mine, everything changed. They changed the story. 3 of them, they did the very same thing. We are very worried about that. And another thing that worries me a lot, we've got graves there. One of our graves, it was damaged by the mine because they built the dam next to it without also talking to us. When we go there to talk to them, they said they were just going to get people to identify them. Till today, nothing has happened to that. And even the cattle that goes there and get lost, there is no compensation on that. They said they were told that they mustn't pay all those things because our stock get inside to their place. Yet that place, it's our land because it was our grazing land. But we were told that, no, we are not going to be compensated of all those things. We are very worried. I'm very worried about that because people are talking. They've employed many people inside. There are some people that have been employed that they have given tenders to those, they've given tenders to those people. Those people are getting money, yet we are not getting anything. Instead, we are losing a lot. We don't have land to plant. We don't have land to feed our animals. We don't even enjoy our land because of dust all the time. We can't even do our rituals there because when we invite people to any ceremony that we are doing, all those people will be affected by the dust all the time. So I've got sleepless nights. We are even worried because when we talk to them, they said if they are moving us, they will be doing so a favor. So they just say they can give a little money so that we can relocate to any place that we want to, of which to us really means a lot. It's a loss to us. It's a loss to us. I would like to thank, finally, God came into our side. I would like to thank All Rise, the lawyers that we are not paying for, of which we had when we joined the other group, of which we had it very late, the group called Umtsejo. Then we joined, we heard about those lawyers. Those lawyers has helped us a lot because the psychologists came to us to check and to give us support. And it was the first time in our experience to get someone who comes to us and listen to our problem and having a sympathy on everything. Really, he helped us a lot. I'm very much happy about having that person, which is Mr. Garrett. He came to our house and he gave us a very good support. And I was very happy because he said he was going to write the book about all the experiences that we are having, knowing that this problem we are having, it is just going to be known by many people around the world. Maybe there will be someone who will have an ear of listening to our problem. Maybe we'll get help at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And now I'd like to introduce our final presenter, Michael Edelstein. Michael is an environmental psychologist. His 50-year academic career in the Environmental Studies and Sustainability Studies programs at Ramapo College of New Jersey, USA, focused on our dysfunctional relationships to the earth, each other, and on fostering a new sustainable paradigm that transforms, restores, and heals us. As a scholar, Edelstein is best known for his work on legacy issues affecting sustainability, most notably issues of environmental contamination, nuclear disaster, and climate change. His work as a scholar, field researcher, expert witness, and activist has taken him across the US, but also abroad to Canada, Russia, Central Asia, Latin America, Africa, and India. He has written several books, including Contaminated Communities, The Social and Psychological Impacts of Residential Toxic Exposure, Contaminated Communities, Coping with Residential Toxic Exposure, and Cultures of Contamination, Legacies of Pollution in Russia and the US. He retired from Ramapo College in June 2022 to focus on his writing, consulting, and community work. We are very, very lucky to have Michael with us today. Thank you, Michael. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me just start out by saying that the whole purpose of my career and the field that I'll speak about, psychosocial impact assessment, is to listen to testimonies such as we just heard. It's amplifying the voices of the people who are actually impacted by various environmental changes that allows those voices then to be heard in a regulatory and a legal context. And that's what motivates me, and I'm deeply moved by the testimony we just heard, and I'm deeply excited by the studies that Garrett and Asanda and Daneo talked about. So I only have a couple of minutes. I'm going to share my screen and see what happens. And trying to make this larger. Well, I'll do it manually. So what I want to talk about is showcasing the power of psychosocial impact assessment, referring to this case that we've been hearing about. And my work in psychosocial impact assessment is stems from the fact that I'm an environmental psychologist. Since the late 1970s, I've been investigating environmental contamination and been involved in studying the impacts of siting of hazardous facilities, waste facilities, nuclear facilities, chemical, petroleum, gas facilities. And what struck me from the beginning was that people become disabled. They lose their voice as the environment has changed around them and they are impacted. And so I very early on became an expert witness in permit hearings and toxic tort litigation in order to take people's voices and to frame them in a way that might have weight in determinations. My work has already been mentioned, but I've worked in many different places and done psychosocial impact assessment in scores of communities. I want to talk about the power of psychosocial impact assessment. When we look at environmental impact assessment, we see that it internalizes the adverse impacts of a project so that it can be considered by those who decide whether to issue permits. But what happens to the things that are externalized, that are overlooked by environmental impact assessment? They get left out of the decisions. And so the goal here with psychosocial impact assessment is to bring the true project costs to the community and the individuals in the community into the process, into the decision making. The way that things generally occur worldwide is that public that is impacted gets alienated by the process. Their stories are not told. Maybe they're given 3 minutes to testify in a hearing, but generally they are overlooked. So psychosocial impact assessment is a tool for assessing those externalities. It examines the impact of individuals, families, communities, members of social networks and kinship groups, clients of different government agencies, customers of different businesses, members of cultural groups, members of society. There have historically been a lot of impediments to psychosocial impact assessment. It's evolved very slowly as a field because, by and large, people with expertise have not been involved in environmental impact assessment or this type of litigation. There's, of course, resistance from project proponents who do not want the impacts to be brought into the process that might, in fact, lead to their projects being denied or significant mitigation required. And they tend to blame the people who were impacted rather than respecting and trying to understand them and trying to avoid those impacts. There's also been resistance from the regulatory environment as well, because oftentimes regulators are proponents of the industry that they regulate. And they rarely have the background in social science that would allow them to understand or empathize with the impact on the local community. Both the proponents and the regulators often see these people as NIMBYs, people concerned with protecting their own backyards, not with legitimate impacts to have addressed. Likewise, legally, these issues have historically been off the legal bandwidth with some exceptions. And overall, they're not given weight. And the whole purpose of psychosocial impact assessment, the work that we're talking about today, is to give weight to the kinds of impacts that people like the last speaker face in their own lives. Now, in my own work, I've developed a theory, the theory of environmental turbulence, which attempts to address all of the things that I've encountered over 50 years, all the psychosocial harm that occurs from undesired environmental change. And those include lifescape changes or changes to how people think, their basic assumptions about their lives, about their health, about themselves, and their sense of control over the world that they live in and the ability to craft their futures. It's about the safety and sanctity of their homes and their communities. It's about the security that they face in their local environment. It's about their livelihoods. And it's about their ability to have social trust that, in fact, their lives and the lives of those they care about will be protected and respected. It's also about lifestyle impacts, the behavior that people carry out in the course of their everyday lives. And we see that people have forced adaptations in those everyday lives to the conditions that unfold. It's also about life strain impacts, the constant and multiple sources of stress that affect people's ability to cope, and the resulting impacts on their emotional health. I also look at issues of environmental stigma, the devaluing of land and the people associated with that land, and the environmental justice issues that are connected to that. And finally, I'll just mention life cycle, which is that these impacts that we've seen today vary dramatically over people's life cycle as well. I had the opportunity of being in South Africa in 2018, running into Kirsten, hearing her speak, and getting involved in preparing a report for litigation that related to the Tendele mine and the local community. And that report was a very rapid assessment. I actually didn't get a chance to interview people in the community. I did hear people from the community speak. I looked at lots of documents. But what's exciting to me about today's program is that we see the work of Garrett and the other colleagues who have been doing in-depth research actually in the community over time that basically confirms the work that I was able to do at that point. I also wanted to mention that I'm involved in a long project in Hawaii. It's been going on for 4 or 5 years, in which I'm looking at the impacts of geothermal energy development on Native Hawaiians. And I'm skipping most of this slide because we're moving fast. But the point here is that how does one capture the way that people are impacted? The ways that we've tried to do that in the past, for example, arguing that their religion is being infringed upon, that has not worked in the legal system. But looking at psychosocial impact assessment provides a way of trying to bring those impacts into the environmental impact assessment process, including historical issues and with Indigenous people, certainly including historical trauma. So while there has, it's been a somewhat lonely career for me in the sense of pursuing a field that I have had colleagues in, but not a great number of them, there's an expanding interest right now in psychosocial impact assessment. The International Association of Impact Assessment has embraced PSIA. We have a very active working group, at least one of whom was in the session observing this morning. So we have a group from all around the world working on psychosocial impact assessment. IAIA has done webinars, including one I did a number of years ago on psychosocial impact assessment. We've been doing conference sessions at all of our conferences, including sessions that will be coming up at our conference in Malaysia this year. And all of the presentations done today could certainly fit into those sessions. And we have a variety of chapters and books on social impact assessment and health impact assessment, dealing with psychosocial impact assessment that are underway, and an evolving book just on PSIA. And the whole goal here is to grow a new generation of psychosocial impact assessment assessors. And what really excites me about today's program is Garrett's work and the work of Asanda and Daneo. This is superb work. It really provides a way of documenting impacts so that they can in fact be addressed. And the whole point here is to help people like the people living near the Tendele mine to really avoid, first of all, having the impacts that they've suffered by having the decision makers who decide about the permits for mines and other projects take into account how it's going to impact the community. And then also trying, after those impacts have occurred, to assess in a way that allows for compensation and for a reclamation of people's lives. So I laud All Rise for being out in front of this effort, for organizing today's program, for doing Garrett's project and bringing the rest of us together. I hope this inspires people to actually think about doing psychosocial impact assessment in their own careers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I am, that wraps up our presentations for this afternoon. And so thank you to all of our speakers for your contributions. You're all experts in your own right. And I know we could have given you, each of you, a whole hour, and that still probably wouldn't have been enough. But as we've said, the whole purpose of today's webinar is to launch, is to mainly launch the study that Dr. Barnwell did. And so we don't have too much time left for questions and answers. I see many of you have been typing in the box, and we'll get to those now with the sort of 10 minutes that we've got left. Hopefully this is just the beginning of the discussion. So we have taken note of all the questions. So apologies in advance if we don't get to all of them. I've also tried to group the questions because a lot of them are quite similar, and then ask our different panelists to answer them, and I'll direct the questions accordingly. Just to also thank all the participants in not only Dr. Barnwell's study, but also the other 3 studies for giving up their time and sharing their experiences. And in doing so, opening up clearly what are very painful wounds. We know it's not easy for you, and we salute you for your courage. So we're going to spend the next few minutes before we close looking at some of those the questions that have come through. And as I've said, to make best of the time we have available, I have grouped them. And so I think most of the questions are directed to you, Garrett. And I'll just phrase them as they've come in. But a lot of questions and comments about methodology of your study, specifically the sample size, how participants were selected, and how this is relevant to the population size of the general community in the area. And then also there were comments that it's perceived to be a narrow focus on the negative impacts, and questions whether there also can be work done on the positive impacts of the mine on people's lives. There was also a request for further work to be done, or did you include psychological impacts of people who've been unemployed or people who are living in abject poverty? And I think some of these comments made by people also caused them to question, how confident can you be in your study based on the sample size? And so let me stop there, and then there's some other parts to the methodology questions as well. But if you can just especially answer around methodology, I think that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janice. And these are really brilliant questions, and I appreciate how people have been engaging with the report in the questions that they're asking as well. So very importantly, it's not a population-based study. So what that means is we weren't looking for general representation across the population. I was presented with a very specific question, which was, what are the impacts of coal mining on those whom I interviewed, who were identified via All Rise. So the people who All Rise are representing, who identify as being impacted by the mines. Just to also speak about a bit about the approach. So as an independent psychologist, I come in and am also quite skeptical. There's supposed to be a healthy level of skepticism when I interview people who have been identified for me. So I go back, I ask about the history, ask about how things have changed over time, what impacts have they had on them. I also ask about, I'll go into it now, but a range of questions. And I come with questioning a bit, have there actually been negative impacts as well? Because many people may not necessarily be affected in these types of assessments and stuff like that. So I have to ask that question. What was very clear to me is the significant level of distress that was experienced. So in these clinical interviews, people presented with traumatic symptoms, experiences that suggest high levels of psychological distress. And I'm quite confident that many of these experiences or the psychological distress is related to some of these processes over time. So specifically, for instance, the grave relocation and the exhumation of bodies, people being the experience being incredibly undignified, and the severing of this link to culture and ancestral connections and so forth. That's just one of the examples. But definitely there are very specific events that those whom I interviewed identify as the cause of their distress. The other thing as well, I think that was quite pronounced for me was the environmental threats, the atmosphere of violence and so forth. So just simply, I wasn't really asking anything about confidence level. I wasn't looking for the generalizability of the findings, but rather the significance of psychological distress with those who I interviewed. That being said, we did run out of time in terms of the interview. So I interviewed 36 people. There were more to interview. So I do hope at some stage, I'm not sure if it will be possible, but to interview more people as well. And just the question about unemployment, it's a very good suggestion. It wasn't within the scope of the question that I was answering though.
No, thanks for that, Garrett. And obviously, after this webinar, and I will give at the end of the webinar a link to the report. And so obviously, in the webinar, Garrett can only present, his time is limited, but we welcome you to go and look at the report, and you'll see far more detailed description of the methodology and the limitations of the study. And then just related to methodology, there were a few questions that came through around establishing pre-mining psychological baselines, whether that was possible. And then also a question of whether cause and effect of mental illnesses were proven through interviews.
Nice, very good questions. Some of this I've partly answered already. So it's the way in which the questions are asked during the interview. Just say that the interviews are quite in depth, so they last for, some of them were up to 3 hours or 4 hours long. And you really track from what was, how were you, how were your family, how was your sense of relationship to place, and your own sense of well-being before mining came. What were your expectations and stuff? What was the process like when mining was introduced? And what are some of the main stresses at the moment as well in relationship to your current life? And in those questions, you can track some of the changes that have taken place. I'd be interested in Michael's perspective as well. But in those, the identification of main events or main traumas and stresses, you are able to at least understand some of the etiology of the distress. So where are some of the roots of the current experience of collective trauma?
Let me just come in on that. I think what Garrett said is exactly correct. There was earlier mention of the idea of the baseline, and I think that in doing this kind of work, one does establish a baseline around the point of change. So what was life like before the mines were created, and what is life like now? That's the point of comparison. So one always reconstructs a baseline as best you can. Obviously, it would be ideal to have research done before the mine. And if it was included in an impact statement, that actually could have been done because the mine wouldn't have been built yet. I also just wanted to quickly note about the prior question. In environmental impact assessment, one is always interested in looking at the significant adverse impacts, because those are the ones that would augur for denying a permit or for mitigating those impacts in a way that the project goes forward. So the focus is on adverse impact in this type of work. And it also makes sense because in proposing a mine and in going through the whole process, there are lots of opportunities for the benefits of the mine to be talked about, including employment benefits. And those benefits are then weighed in the decision. But if the adverse impacts aren't also brought forward, they can't be weighed as well. And so that's why the focus on adverse impact is extremely important here. And the specific focus on the people who are most impacted, because they're the ones for whom mitigation or avoiding to begin with the kind of adverse harm needs to be understood in the process. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks
That's a
very
great
much, Matthew.
response. Janice, can I answer Danea's question as well?
Yes, please do, about
Okay.
lost in translation, the language.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
no, significant. I was really lucky to be supported by Lichle, who is a isiZulu speaker, a counselor. So the language in that sense, I felt, while I probably couldn't reach the depth of suffering that people experience, I think the report speaks for itself. And in the clinical assessment, you are looking at how people present, so their facial expressions, whether they have reactions to the answers and stuff like that. But also the flattened effect, you know, as well. When you're living with chronic kind of trauma, there can also be a flattening of one's sense of self. Your energy is depleted as well. So you're following things like sleep patterns, asking about sleep, disturbances, nightmares, and so forth. And all of this kind of gives a constellation of what is someone's psychic experience. And so I really appreciate that question, a very good question to ask, and by observing body language and getting all these other indicators as well, you're able to build a bit of a picture. I, however, think reports, so for instance, the depth that you, the chapter that I read on the graves is significant, and there's something more that you get in terms of being able to connect deeper to these spiritual connections, the meaning of language used, and so forth.
No, thanks, Garrett, and thanks, Michael. You know, we have run out of time, and I think what we'd like to do is we've got copies of all the questions and process some of them more, and then maybe set up some further working groups or workshops where we can have a lot more participation. Yeah, I know we've given lots of food for thought today. Before I open it up to the panelists, just for one last word, I just wanted to run through a few of the additional questions and comments that we haven't touched on, and then maybe these things can be looked at in future. One was about including key stakeholders in just transition. Have they been engaged? Because there are many lessons that can be learned from this work. So I think certainly as coal mining and coal-fired power stations move out the picture because of South Africa and the world's commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you know, there is going to be a loss of jobs and a change in the sector. So these can these kind of findings be also shared with the people working in the just transition sector, which I think is a good comment. Just questions around, were these issues picked up in the EIAs? So EIA, obviously, and Michael, you touched on this, having an important role to play in identifying that pre-mining baseline condition as well, and then also looking at some of these impacts, which we don't often see picked up in the environmental impact assessments. And so then there was also a comment about, I think it was a comment to Asanda, just about your comment on the representation of employees. And the comment was made that a lot of the employees are unionized, so they are represented. I think that was just a response to something in your presentation. All right, so I'm just going to open the up to all the panelists now to have one last word before we close. And we'll end with Garrett last, but maybe Asanda, if you want to have your say, Dineo, Michael, and then Garrett.
Sure, I mean, I can go, you said 1 minute. I've responded to the comment on representation. I think when we're talking about representation, at least what I was talking about is trying to differentiate between membership and which is nominal representation of workers and actual representation based on people's demands. And I think I've replied at length in the chat box, but also what I was sharing, yes, it's based on Somkhele and the data collected from Somkhele, but I think it draws also from a lot of other literature that is widely available, that is peer-reviewed about the crisis of worker representation in mining, in other workplaces in the country generally. So it's not a specific on the Somkhele issue, but it certainly was confirmed by the people who spoke to in Somkhele. One last thing, I suppose, for me is I think a lot of the questions that people have highlighted sort of raise questions around strengthening community research capacity to sort of, you know, help with the data that we gather. We go in as researchers for a very short period of time, but I think if we can also work towards strengthening capacity, research capacity in communities, where communities can gather data continuously on all of these very, very critical questions that have been raised, one by the reports that were shared today, but also by people in the chat. I think if we can have people in communities who are strengthened to collect this data, it would help in answering the questions around impact, where you have to trace what was happening before, what changes happened, what's happening now, and also around SLPs. I think we are inundated with reports on SLPs, and I'm saying this again in response to one of the questions. We are inundated with reports on SLPs that are only showing one side of what's happening with SLPs. I think communities, again, need to be capacitated to gather data because they live in these communities. If, for instance, in the case of Somkhele, where we read SLP reports saying ABCD has been done, and we went with community activists to all these places to look at the breaches, and the breaches were falling apart. So communities that can actually contextualize what is reported in these SLPs through research would really help strengthen not necessarily an incorrect narrative, but a narrative that some people might feel like is not complete because the sample size was small or whatever the case may be. Thank you, and back to you, Janice.
Thanks very much, Asanda. I'm not sure if we have Dineo. Oh, Dineo, you with us still? Would you like to just give some parting comments?
I think just one comment, which I think was also articulated by Asanda, and I think it's quite important, particularly on the issue of sample sizes. So as research institutes, but also just generally as academics, often I think the research that we conduct would not necessarily just be on one side. I mean, I know, for instance, and I'd speak to the work that we do at SWAP, we've done a comparative study of Somkhele and the Mpumalanga province, where we're looking at, where I've looked at dispossession, where we've looked at issues around the material dependence on coal, as well as issues around resistance. And what's interesting is that this is also happening in Lephalale. So some of our findings are actually really overlapping, but not just around coal, but also platinum. Having worked, for instance, in Mokopane, which is platinum mine, you see that issues around dispossession, the loss of graves or desecration of graves, and also issues around jobs, issues around lack of consultation, traditional leaders being centered in local political economies, but not necessarily distributing what they gain from mining deals to communities is actually impacting the whole of South Africa. So I think what we're presenting here is not simply in vacuum or having taken a small sample and making generalizations. I think I'm confident to say that if you look at work that's been done by Groundwork, Earthlife, all kinds of organizations, whether they're national or international, you'd actually find that there is an issue around extractivism in this country and how it benefits a few people. And it doesn't necessarily trickle down to communities. And that's why we've seen quite a lot of resistance and uprising in these communities. I just wanted to round up on that.
Thanks very much, Tendele. I think that is very important. You know, while the study is being done on a very specific community, affected by a very specific mine, it's important to hear that a lot of these lessons and impacts can also apply in other areas. And I think that relates to one of the comments raised by somebody in the Q&A of how are we going to relate our study and findings to the South African environmental policymakers. And also taking these research to the community. Obviously, this study, the findings were fed back to the participants before they were shared on a greater platform, but it's also taking these kind of findings back to the community as well. So I see in the Q&A, there's lots of requests for that as well. Michael, would you like to have your parting words, please?
Certainly. Well, I've greatly enjoyed this conversation. This is apparently a program that was done for Mental Health Month. And I just want to target the issues that we're talking about as a different way of thinking about mental health, both in terms of what goes into mental health, what should be considered, and what the notion of prevention of problems is. By doing psychosocial impact assessment and bringing it into a process of decision-making, one has the opportunity to prevent all of the things that that Garrett and our other colleagues have talked about. And that's a very powerful role that I would like to invite people to start thinking about playing. It's not one that psychologists normally think about or other mental health professionals. I want to make one other point, which is picking up on something Demea said in her presentation about interdisciplinarity. What we have is the need for all of us to really begin to think in an interdisciplinary context, to really understand all of the complex issues that go into the dynamics that we look at in our own work and the way we normally configure it. And what we have in these studies that are represented in this discussion is really convergence across 4 different approaches to the same topic. And the convergence is really remarkable in terms of the actual findings. I think that's an extremely important issue in terms of replicating results. And being able to, from my experience of almost 50 years in this field, you begin to be able to generalize from case studies to other cases and to be able to understand what can be carried forth, even though every case is, of course, unique in many respects. But there's underlying dynamics that are not necessarily unique that really can be generalized. And there's an incredible power to the social science that we can bring to this, and its implications for mental health, I think, are profound. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for presenting. I foresee lots of further discussions around integrating some of this work into sort of more international work and approaches to work these findings into further assessments that are done for these kind of projects. And Garrett, would you like to give your parting words, please?
Yeah, just first of all, to thank you very much, Asada Benya, Danael Skosana, and Michael Edelstein for being part of the panel. And really, I think the convergence is so important. The main thing that I want to leave with today is also the report is released, as far as I understand, and the methodology is important and quite clear in that report. But the report speaks about something as well that's quite human and very urgent, which is their testimonies of 35 people from 26 different families who are currently experiencing incredible psychological adversities. And we can't lose sight of that, that there are people being affected here today. I really appreciate the person who joined us today, who shared her testimony as well. And we really need to foreground these voices when we speak about this report and the experiences that people are having today. And that doesn't negate any of the other experiences that people are also having, but there is a particular, there are several people, the people I interviewed, and potentially others that really require some form of support. And some of the issues that have caused their suffering are unresolved. And I think that that's something that we need to take away from today as well, that it's not only a report, it's people's lives.
Thanks very much, Garrett. And again, echo Kirsten's thank you for doing the report so sensitively, so thoroughly, so professionally. Yeah, we look forward to further discussions of taking these issues forward, and certainly looking at your recommendations in the report. All right, so that brings us to the end. Thank you for those who've stayed on. We have gone over time, but it was a lot to get in. And as I say, this is the beginning of the conversation, certainly not the end. And I think listening to all the speakers and the findings of their various studies, for me, what is particularly alarming is that this situation exists and has been allowed to exist for some time, despite all the checks and balances in place. You know, despite Section 24 of the Constitution, giving everyone a right to an environment that's not harmful to our health or well-being. Also, all the legislation in place around EIAs, identifying impacts and mitigation measures, processes that are supposed to be done by independent, objective environmental experts. We have NEMA Section 2 principles, and a whole lot of other decision-making criteria that our licensing authorities must apply every time they evaluate a license, and the powers they have to add additional conditions when granting that license. And we also have performance assessments, or environmental audits as they're called now, as well as a number of other types of environmental audits that are required to be done, and in this case, required to be done on an annual basis. The authorities have all sorts of powers and duties to respond to complaints and issue directives and compliance notices, and actually to enforce license conditions and other legal provisions. And we also have lenders, the financiers, who have their own sustainability and environmental checks and balances to ensure that financing doesn't cause environmental harm or lead to social inequity. So our question is then, how do we get here, not only in this community, but for what we hear in many other communities around the country? You know, why does the health and well-being of some of the most vulnerable groups in the society become even more at risk? And so what we've observed is that it appears to be a combination of inadequate EIAs and public participation done without the necessary expertise, in cultural practices and livelihoods, lack of objectivity, poor auditing, and lack of enforcement by government, but obviously all topics for future workshops. So certainly as All Rise, we hope that the findings of this study not only bring us closer to securing justice for this community, but also bring much needed awareness to the deficiencies in our healthcare systems and environmental management systems that need to be addressed. So thank you again to all our speakers and to all the participants of the studies for being willing to share their experiences. Thank you to all those attending the webinar. I know there was some frustration with the format, but obviously our focus was to prevent the findings, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to host future workshops where we will actually structure it to allow a lot more participation. We hope you found it to be of value. Let's keep the conversation going. And if the administrators can just put the last slide with our website address on the screen, please. And that is, if you go to our website under the resources page, under reports, you will find a copy of Dr. Barnwell's report that was released today. So thank you very much. And thank you for all of those, especially who stayed on, and hope to meet again to take the conversation further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.